And when you look at the impacts to housing, the amount of money it would cost to fix flood-based housing issues is going to be tremendously more expensive than I believe what we may see in Florida. California is a whole nother. As long as I've been doing this, I've never seen a more disturbing disaster in my life. And I think they lost 6,800 homes in that. And so each one's tremendously different, and the cost will vary based on what the services are that are needed. As far as overall cost, I've heard numbers inside from my finance guys saying that we're probably spending about $200 million a day right now just responding to the 4 disasters that we're facing.
Yeah. And how would you rank them? What would in terms of hurricanes, what's going to be the most expensive for us? And the second most? I've heard estimates that Texas will be number 1. Is that accurate?
Probably Texas. Well, I don't know. I take that back because we're not done with Puerto Rico. We're still trying to uncover. That. But I would believe that right now Texas is probably the most expensive one. But here again, that's just a pure guess, and we still have numbers coming in.
And obviously, with long-term funding, we have to have local government, state government engaged. But they need to make plans for long-term investments to recover and to make sure that they're sustainable. But it's difficult for them to do that without knowing the amount of money that's available, right. Isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here again, the money comes mostly, the largest majority of the funding that states interact with FEMA is definitely on the recovery end. And that goes back to the pre-disaster mitigation point. How do you plan to implement mitigation strategies when you have to get hit and you're not sure how much money you're going to come into based on the type of disaster? That's why I think that we have to pre-plan, take it out of recovery and put it up front so that you can do better visionary planning over the next couple of years to truly mitigate your communities.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Senator Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing on hurricanes. And I appreciate the administrator speaking of California. This hearing is not about wildfires, but I would like to urge that we do everything we can to, as you recognize we lost 42 lives in California, and the estimate is currently that we lost 8,900 homes and structures. On that point, from FEMA, there is still a need. You're doing a great job. The Army Corps of Engineers, I was there. I visited the site. I've met with the families, and you're absolutely right. It's devastating to those families in that community. In terms of FEMA, there is still a need, and I'll just put this on your radar, for individual assistance to help cover temporary housing. You mentioned that it's a big issue throughout the country and certainly in California around affordable housing. And I know that FEMA does not have the number of trailers and they're not on the production line in a way that we can get them to California as soon as they're needed. So there's still a need for temporary housing help and basic essentials like clothing and baby formula. And from HUD, if you can just pass this on, CDBG funding for permanent housing is a big issue. Crop insurance from USDA. And then from the SBA, we need business loans for small businesses that have been destroyed. So I thank you for that. On October 27th, through the Environment and Public Works Committee, which I'm also on, we sent a letter to FEMA and the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers asking for information about a timeline and the work that has been completed or is yet to be done as it relates to debris. So I'd like to get an answer to that, and if we can get that within the next week, I'd appreciate that. There are about 7 specific questions. But as you're aware, and has been mentioned here, there are millions of cubic feet of debris in Puerto Rico. And it is my understanding that we're looking at debris that is large. It ranges from rooftops to garage doors to refrigerators and couches, debris and that the people who live there cannot pick up and move. There's also been a compromise to the landfills in Puerto Rico that existed before the hurricanes hit and remain a problem. It is my understanding that FEMA plans to remove the debris, but I'm not clear on what the timeline is for actually getting that completed. Can you tell me what that plan is?
So each one of the events is extraordinarily different again, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to debris removal. For example, the California wildfires, if I may use that as an example. Because of the nature of the hazard, you first have to go through and make sure that you remove all the hazardous materials from personal property. Then, obviously, as you said, the number of deaths is projected to go up to over 80, and that's because we're still searching for remains in a very humane manner, trying to make sure that we go through the debris to find remains of the burning area. After all the environmental piece is done and that we correctly go through to look for remains, then a lot of the debris contracting is done at the local level through private contracts. If those contracts fail or the governor requests me specifically, then we can mission assign the Army Corps of Engineers, which I believe you guys have been mission assigned in California, similar to also Puerto Rico. Debris in Florida was done differently. A large majority of that was done at the local level by debris contracts and pre-event contracts that they establish. So each one of these may have different timelines because of the types of debris, but like Puerto Rico.
Yeah, what is the timeline for Puerto Rico?
What's after that?
Senator, I don't have an exact timeline for Puerto Rico. We have just started scratching the surface on debris removal. We've run into some really interesting politics within the 78 municipalities that make up Puerto Rico in terms of how they are allowing us to gain access. And so we're in some significant negotiations. Many of the municipalities have come back and said, we don't really want you to do it. We'll take care of it ourselves. So we're going through that right now. I will respond to the letter that you sent with a much more definitive timeline than what I just gave you.
And then, and if you could also follow up on this point about what jurisdictions within Puerto Rico are hesitant to cooperate with your efforts, so that we can make sure that we do our part to figure out how to get some cooperation.
We'll do that, Senator.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Dr. Cadlick, my understanding is that the debris piles that are occurring in Puerto Rico, that they are wet from the recent rains. They are attracting pests that range from rodents to mosquitoes, and there is also a concern that the pets that are going there and the rodents that are going there are leaving great amounts of urine that is also seeping into the waterways. Can you talk for a moment about the health risks associated with this accumulating debris?
Well, ma'am, there are several issues that have to be dealt with in that. One is the moldy kind of debris that you'd be anticipating, and again, fungal growths that would be causing exacerbations for respiratory disease like asthma. Also, you'd be very concerned about some of the immunosuppressive effects of certain fungal growths that are out there, particularly with immunocompromised situations. Probably the biggest concern about debris piles is that you find people climbing on them, rooting around in them, so there's likely of lacerations, injuries, and infections, soft tissue injuries that come from that.
And bacterial diseases, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, bacterial diseases.
That can lead to death.
That would be that. And the last one you didn't mention, but I'll mention because it's a matter of topical interest, is leptospirosis, which is endemic to Puerto Rico. Occurs typically during the rainy season, August through December. There have been some cases already been defined or declared, and a couple of deaths suspected with that. It's a disease that is remedied by antibiotic therapy. About a week after the landfall of the hurricane, we were working with the state epidemiologist, and again, everything we do is in support of the Department of Health on Puerto Rico, but basically making available courses of antibiotic treatment to basically treat anticipated levels of leptospirosis and other bacterial infections. Typically, leptospirosis occurs in about a couple hundred cases a year. We'd expect that to probably go higher than that because of the nature of the events. So we've provided several thousand courses of treatment for Puerto Rico. Beyond those kinds of circumstances, you'd be concerned about tetanus. We've also made available tetanus vaccines through CDC, and also have made available 24 environmental health officers to work with the Department of Puerto Rico as well as epidemiologists to track not only these kinds of environmental hazards, but also the cases that would be associated with them.
And Mr. Chairman, I recognize my time is up. I would like, as a follow-up from each who has information about the incidents that we're also hearing of people in Puerto Rico drinking water from Superfund sites because of their desperation to get drinking water, and obviously there are obvious health risks, huge health risks associated with that. Thank you.
Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here and getting a chance to walk through this. I have a multitude of questions I'm going to try to blitz through in a short period of time. Mr. Long, let me ask you this. This comes back to the preparation side of this. The Biggert Waters flood insurance program in 2012 required a report every 6 months on how we're doing on the debt, what's happening there, what process do we have to be able to work out of the flood insurance debt. The previous administration just stopped doing that report at the end of last year, so we don't have that really for 2 years. So it made it difficult coming into this year and trying to deal with obvious flood issues when we don't have a report for the last 2 years. Do you know when that is planned to restart? And I understand full well in the chaos of all it's trying to go with what's happening currently, that's probably going to be behind again. But do you know where that is in the process of restarting?
I do not, but we will follow up directly with you.
That would be helpful. You also mentioned in your testimony about trying to interact with private entities in the private sector on flood insurance. Do you have any specific ideas on that, things that you plan to be able to bring at the end of this?
While the NFIP program is underneath, my authorities, I'm not an insurance expert when it comes to fixing the NFIP. Going into Harvey, if I remember correctly, and this is, give or take, a couple million here, we were $24 billion in debt roughly. And then anytime you have a massive event, Katrina sent it into debt, Sandy sends it into debt, Harvey, Irma are going to send it into further debt, which you guys have recognized. We have to fix the business framework, and it's got to require a solution from the private sector. I think the private sector should drive a lot of the market. And, if we're going to continue to reward bad behavior by building in flood zones, then there needs to be actuarial risks that are involved. And I fully understand the affordability issues, but I also believe that we can't continue to allow conducting business under the same framework and continuing to go into debt. I don't want to run a program that goes into debt. Right. So I know what I don't know, and I know that we need the private sector support. I need your support to figure out the best way forward.
So let's work our way through this, which we understand will be months in the process and years in many places in the process. But we do need some help to be able to sit down at the table and be able to figure this out. We have ideas that we're bringing to it. Obviously, for the practitioners that are working through this, are going to have specific ideas. We've got to deal with outside private sector insurance. We don't want to create a situation where private sector creates insurance policies, and then as soon as they have claims, they walk away from it.
Right.
That doesn't help those individuals. It doesn't help us, federal government. There has to be some ways to be able to establish some backstops that will work long term and can provide some affordability. So I'd like to commit that in the days ahead, we're going to try to get some ideas worked out and look at a long term plan. That's not going to be a year to resolve. It's going to be a decade or more to resolve, but we got to be able to get started on this. I know with FEMA as well, there's been some interaction, and I'm not going to press you on this because we've talked about it before, but it is odd still in Florida and in Houston and in Puerto Rico that if a United Way facility has devastation or a zoo or a museum has devastation, they can engage with FEMA for help. But if a mosque, a synagogue, or a church has devastation, they cannot. All of those are nonprofits. But for those that are considered houses of worship, they can engage in the same way. I feel like in reading the law for the 1990s, when Congress said that nonprofits would be included, that's all nonprofits. And I'll be able to continue that conversation in the days ahead with you on that. Sure. I know there's been some pushback, which I think is reasonable to be able to ask that question on that.
Sure.
General Jackson, by the way, your family's doing good?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, sir.
Thanks for the way you continue to be able to serve the nation. You mentioned a comment about half of the power generation in Puerto Rico is from wind and solar, and half of that is from fossil fuels. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, Senator.
So of those that are there, what remain? What was the most resilient? What is still working? What is redeemable of that?
Very interesting, Senator, that you asked that, because I was very surprised when I flew over the renewable sites, the solar and the wind. The actual blades of the wind farms were snapped off, and the solar panels were all smashed. And the actual power plants that held up the best were the typical standard power plants, be it the natural gas or coal-fired or heavy diesel or what have you. So just the structures themselves held up better than the renewables did, based on what I saw.
I'm not anti-renewable, to say the least, but I think part of the conversation that we have to have in helping Puerto Rico get back on its feet is look at resiliency long-term. So I want us to be able to look at all of those things as we go through the process, and I know that'll be a common conversation around this horseshoe, and to be able to figure out how we actually get them back in place. I'm asking a question that I know is unfair, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you up front. We're all concerned about why Puerto Rico did not choose to do mutual aid for their power reconstruction. In Texas did, Florida did, other groups when they've experienced it, they asked for mutual aid engaged. What have you been told why they didn't do that? Now, you can't tell me why. I'm only asking, what have you been told why they didn't ask for mutual aid? And Mr. Long, the question's coming to you as well next on that. So, General Jackson, what have you been told why they didn't request mutual aid?
Senator, I've been told that the reason they did outreach at some point for mutual aid, but because it's a cost-shared arrangement and Puerto Rico is in the financial situation that they're in, that utility companies were hesitant to engage because there was no guarantee of cost-share payment. Now, that changed, I believe, when the cost-share arrangement was waived, and then they re-engaged. Public power utilities re-engaged. But by that time, PREPA had already reached out and had engaged with a sole source contract, and that's how that arrangement was started. That's what I've been told through multiple sources, but I obviously don't have any authority.
I understand, because again, I'm not asking what they did or why they made the decision, just what you're told. Mr. Long, is that the same thing you were told as well?
General Jackson's correct, and I agree with him. Many companies are not willing to engage until there's a guarantee of 100%.
Right.
And the bottom line is that I spoke with Governor Rosselló yesterday. They are going to re-engage the EMAC process for power support. I think specifically they're having conversations with the states of Florida and New York. And the goal is that my federal coordinating officer, Mike Byrne, has requested that PREPA make sure that we are unified with the Army Corps so that we're not working in separate streams, but we're working together in a consolidated effort.
We will follow up with your staff because I have another question that's a process issue that we'll have to just talk through, and that is at times when FEMA can't get it done with contracts, you're punting to Army Corps of Engineers to be able to handle contracts. And what I'd be interested to know is the contracting process. Right. Which one takes longer, which one's more efficient, which one has greater cost. At times there is some overlap in between to who's got debris removal, at what level FEMA can handle it, at what level they need to be able to hand it off. For us, that's going to be helpful just to be able to know, because those are federal dollars there, which one's more efficient. Do we need to buffer one up to be able to correct another one?
Can I answer the question? We do not typically contract to rebuild power grids. We mission assign the Army Corps of Engineers, who handles the contracts directly to get the job done. The best case scenario is the example of Florida. Florida Power and Light controls their destiny when it comes to restoring their own power grid and then activating mutual aid, and then FEMA basically serves in a supportive federal role to reimburse those actions.
Yeah, my question won't be specifically on power. It'll be on all contracting, whether it be debris removal or whatever it may be. When we have to hire individual contractors, who handles that more efficiently? How does that actually work? Which one takes longer and such? So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heidkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleague from New Hampshire for letting me go first. I have a few questions about the Navy ship Comfort. And according to the Department of Defense, the Comfort has one of the largest trauma facilities in the United States, is equipped as well as any kind of floating hospital can be equipped. It is capable of treating 200 patients per day with 250 beds available. But yet we hear over and over again that there are people going without medical treatment. Despite that capability and the staff of over 800 trained personnel, the Comfort's treated only 100 patients 17 days after arriving in Puerto Rico on October 3rd and 30 days after Hurricane Maria made landfill. Dr. Cadillac, how many patients have been treated on the Comfort so far that you're familiar with, and can you elaborate on the challenges that we've had getting patients to the Comfort?
Sure, I think in the last count was 121 as a result of that. But ma'am, before you make a judgment on that, let me just explain what was the approach using the Comfort as it related to its high acuity capabilities, which you're correct in saying there are 200 beds, but there are more importantly 50 intensive care unit beds on that boat. And that really was the capability we needed, because quite frankly, if you looked at the events on the island, we had a level 1 trauma center at Centro Medico, which was the east side of the island.
So how many of the patients that were treated aboard the Comfort were actually ICU patients?
Were high acuity patients.
Yeah.
Well, if I recall correctly, over 60. I can get you that number, though, ma'am.
Yeah.
But the point was, we used that as a floating intensive care unit, primarily in the basis when we were trying.
So it's your judgment that the Comfort has been fully utilized for the need in Puerto Rico?
What it did was cover a critical bet that we had, which was based on the risk that hospitals would lose power because the majority of them, in fact, all of them were on generator for a period of time. Now we have 70% back on the grid. But for the time being, when the hospitals were on generators and the risk of failure before we could put backup generators, we used the Comfort as a place where we could take high acuity patients, transport them by helicopter, by rotary wing medevac helicopter.
I get all that, but I think anybody who looks at this, and maybe it's just the news, and I will turn to you, Administrator Long, who looks at the news and says, look, there's this huge medical need, people going without treatment, people at risk of losing their life. We have this incredible asset. This is an island. It's not like, the United States of America where you might have something 3,000 miles away. Why does it seem to be, to me, underutilized?
So I appreciate the question. I understand the frustrations of the questions. The goal is always, anytime you move medically fragile people, patients out of a hospital, you take a risk at them surviving that move to begin with. So the goal is to stabilize the situation in the hospitals. And there was a tremendous effort to do that because what we ran into was not only hospitals operating without power, but making sure that the generator actually worked, getting it fuel on a regular basis, and then maintenance of the generator ongoing. These generators aren't designed to run for months. And so what we did is we initiated the Comfort, and Bob, you could probably talk about the timeline it takes to actually do that. It's about an 8-day process to even turn the keys on, fuel the boat, get everybody's staff to even mobilize and go to the island. It's a long process, but the bottom line is we basically set up a 911 system, as I understand, to where in 2 or 3 cases, a hospital generator would fail. We would move the most medically fragile patients via helicopter from the hospital to the Comfort. I would argue that it was being utilized very well. And again, the goal is try to get the hospitals to operate. We're always going to be second guessed on everything, but try to get the hospitals to operate and serve patients where they are.
Administrator Long, I know Senator Tester hit on this, but one of the concerns that I have, given what now has landed on your plate, is that all of our talk about mitigation, all of our talk about preparedness will take a back seat to just dealing with the disasters that you've been handed. We all know, based on experiences with Katrina, with Sandy, this is not, we're here for a month and then we leave. What are you going to do, or what recommendations would you make to us in terms of staffing so that you have the capability of actually looking at mitigation and not just dealing with the crisis?
Sure, and I've been concerned about that because my staff and the coordination through the federal departments. I mean, tens of thousands of people have been deployed. I mean, if you look at the actual number that's been deployed starting with Harvey, it's been unprecedented, and I don't have to say that. And unfortunately, I do feel like we're losing a lot of the successes that have actually been implemented as a result of the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. A lot of things went right. So that we don't lose Puerto Rico, I plan to do an after-action report to make sure that we understand where we are versus where we need to be, specifically when it comes not only to Puerto Rico, but island territories.
Yeah.
I want to go back and hit the reset button. In regards to staff specifically, eventually I would like to change the entire hiring process of the Federal Emergency Management Agency to adopt a more FBI-style academy approach. I would also like to expand my staff out of those regional offices to the states and islands to make sure that we're a part of that discussion every day.
I think you received an incredible amount of bipartisan support, in part because we understood what role you played in the look back on Katrina. We hope that you will be equally critical of the work that you've done as administrator, but that you also will collaborate with us in terms of what you need. I think Senator Tester said it best. You can't look at this and then understand this continues and think that we don't have a huge challenge where we need to look at all hands on deck. What are the requirements that we want to impose on states so that they understand what their role is going to be, so they're not overly dependent on the federal government, but that this work is seamless. And so I look forward to additional conversations with you.
Absolutely.
And to understanding what you need. But we can't give you what you need if you don't ask.
And we would be happy to put that ask together. And if I may, each citizen is responsible for their own individual preparedness. We do not have a true culture of preparedness in this country, and we need to hit the reset button and look at how we, partner with the Department of Education and give people critical skills. I mean, Gail McGovern with the Red Cross said that 1 in 4 of us is going to have to perform CPR, to someone else at any given time. Are we giving people those Boy Scout type skills? As well as tangible things to understand that they may be the true first responder for an active shooter event, or if they're your neighbor's house has collapsed upon them. That many times citizens are the first true responder, and we have to start dedicating our public awareness and cultural preparedness campaigns to doing that, as well as figuring out what the states need.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for your hard work and all of you working under very, very difficult circumstances. We hope that Congress can be an effective partner for you.
And Senator Heinekamp, real quick before you leave, you may not have been here, but one of the action items I'm taking away from here is literally that state-by-state, territory-by-territory assessment. Who has prepared themselves? What is that? What is the current state, so we can determine something, mitigation. We will definitely follow that up with a hearing.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Grand Forks flood was a devastating event. We all pulled our state disaster plan off, blew the dust off of it, and realized that we needed to take that process more seriously. So nothing like a state disaster, the caliber of this, to realign all of our thinking.
Yep. So we'll work with you on that. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all to the witnesses for being here today and for the work you do on behalf of our country. We are very, very grateful. I've got 3 basic questions, and so I'm going to try to move through them quick so we can get to all of them. Administrator Long, I want to again thank you for being here today and also for briefing several senators on a call on September 28th in which you updated us on the U.S. government's relief efforts in Puerto Rico. On this call, you said that the airports and seaports were all heavily damaged. You also added that the road networks were in many cases impassable and that you lacked trucks and personnel to be able to effectively distribute the ample relief supplies you had waiting on pallets. So when did FEMA and the Department of Defense first make the assessment that the damage to the airports and seaports would encumber the delivery of relief supplies?
Almost immediately, and that was the logistical complexity of being able to put forward the humanitarian mission. All of those ports were damaged, but it wasn't just the ports. It was the air traffic control systems that also guide those in.
So it was almost immediate. So when did you make the determination that you would need the full capabilities of the United States military to be able to distribute resources based on that assessment? And when did you first ask the Department of Defense for the type of assets that were eventually provided for the relief response?
And if I may defer here, but let me be clear. We engaged the Department of Defense before Maria hit. And so there were a ton of assets on the island, before the storm hit. But you can only put so many people and equipment on an island, or you expose it to the storm, and it becomes useless after the fact. So it's a balancing game. But if I may defer.
Sure. Go ahead.
My name is Bob Saley.
Right.
As you may recall,
Make sure your microphone's on, please.
There it is. Sorry. Hurricane Irma came through first. As you know, it hit St. Thomas and St. John, did a lot of damage. We actually had DOD assets in the area. We had the U.S.
So I'm just going to interrupt for a second, because on the September 28th call with FEMA and other agencies, the DOD representative stated that the U.S. Northern Command was working on a plan to mobilize an additional sustainment force to Puerto Rico. Now, that's 8 days after the hurricane hit. Additionally, according to FEMA's website, on October 1st, U.S. Northern Command delivered approximately 310,000 meals, 150,000 liters of water, generators, tarps, additional sustainment units, and leading components of aviation command and control. Given that it was apparent from FEMA and DoD assessment that both the airports and seaports of Puerto Rico were heavily damaged and that this would cause immense distribution challenges, why did it take until October 1st to deliver aviation command and control to the island? And why on September 28th was the U.S. Northern Command still working to finalize its plans to deliver a sustainment force? And when did the sustainment force arrive?
So, ma'am, to answer that question, again, there's concurrent activity always in these events. As I indicated, we had Navy ships in the area, the U.S. Kearsarge, the Oak Hill. They had helicopters. They were doing search and rescue capabilities. Simultaneously, U.S. Transcom, which is responsible for strategic airlift and providing C-17s and C-5s, was flying in assessment teams for airfields. As the administrator pointed out, a number of those airfields had severe damage, no navigation aids, no radars, those kinds of things. That equipment had to be put in place. All of this was happening well before the 28th, ma'am. I don't know where the impression got. There was
I'll tell you what, the impression came from the questions we asked on a conference call on September 28th.
Capability.
So what I would ask as a follow-up, we'll of course have these letters to you directly, is some real specifics here, because I think all of us were concerned that 8 days after the hurricane hit, it seemed like we were still having to suggest in that call that the United States military was going to be necessary to help get some supplies distributed because of the impassability of transportation infrastructure. I do, just because I have a couple of minutes left, want to move on to one other question to Administrator Long. Last week, ProPublica posted a story that stated that FEMA was declining to publicly release a document drafted several years ago that detailed how FEMA would respond to a major hurricane in Puerto Rico. According to ProPublica, FEMA started drafting the plans known as the Hurricane Annex after the lack of preparation in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. ProPublica also found similar plans posted on DoD's website for Hawaii, which detailed an 85-step process to restore electricity on Hawaii in the event of a hurricane. So why is FEMA not releasing this document to the public? And could you please commit to making it public? And if not, will you please articulate what was in the Hurricane Annex and what steps you followed in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria?
Sure, Senator. We gave it to the committee last night, apparently.
Okay.
I was just briefed, but I was unaware of the issue.
All right.
I'd be happy to follow up with you directly.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And in that case, I will also just, before yielding back the remainder of my time, let you all know that, well, actually, we have a minute. So instead of giving this to the record, I did want to touch on the U.S. Virgin Islands and where we are in terms of power restoration and tourism, because perhaps even more so than Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands economy fundamentally depends on the ability of the islands to host tourists from all over the world. The Virgin Islands suffered a direct hit from not only Hurricane Maria, but Hurricane Irma as well. These storms knocked out the power across these islands, and the islands cannot expect to begin to reestablish its tourism economy without the restoration of power, to say the least. Yet, after more than a month, the U.S. Virgin Islands report that less than a third of the territories have power up and running. So what steps are FEMA and DoD taking to restore full power to the U.S. Virgin Islands? And what is FEMA's current estimate of when 100% of the islands will have power?
Yep. So, excellent point. You know, the Virgin Islands were hit equally as hard as Puerto Rico, and the bottom line is they're basically in the same approach, but there's two different approaches being taken to restore the power, as I understand it. So where we proactively push forward the Army Corps of Engineers in Puerto Rico, the power authority that represents the Virgin Islands is in control and conducting their own contracts and leading their power restoration. But if the last number I saw was that power should be restored by, December timeframe as well. But here again, that's just an estimate.
Okay. Well, thank you again for your participation. I appreciate it very much. And Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Senator Hassel, let me just brief you what I know about that report you referenced. The annex is jointly owned by FEMA and the state of Puerto Rico. It was not released because Puerto Rico did not give FEMA permission to share it with the media, we got it as for official use only document, which we're happy to share with you. But until Puerto Rico agrees to release it, it can't be released to the general public.
Well, I would appreciate to see it. I'm glad we have it, and I'll follow up with you further. Thank you.
Senator Daines.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. Thank you for testifying today. And Administrator Long, it's good to see you again. I got to tell you, folks out in eastern Montana, we're very grateful with the fact that you listened to our pleas when we had some devastating wildfires that took out much of Garfield County. And I think we've seen sometimes the criteria for dealing with a rural situation, rural environment, which much of Montana is, can be a bit different than a disaster that hits one of our urban centers. And I want to thank you for your responsiveness and, importantly, for your action. And the folks out in eastern Montana appreciate that a lot. We had a terrible wildfire season in Montana this past summer. In fact, Secretary Perdue listed the top wildfires in the nation as ranked by dollars spent to fight them. You know, we spent over $2 billion fighting wildfires this season, and still not over yet. But the number one fire in the nation was in Montana, the Lolo Peak Fire. The number 3 fire in the nation was in Montana, the Rice Ridge Fire, just in terms of dollars. So it was one of those terrible seasons. And again, thank you, Mr. Long, for what you did in response to help us there in Montana. Much of the discussion here today has been on Puerto Rico and the devastating hurricane and the loss of the grid. Mr. Long, I will tell you, I was a bit surprised when I heard the story of a small contractor of 2 people. Most have never heard of, including myself, being awarded a contract that was worth $300 million to rebuild Puerto Rico's power grid. In the contract, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, claimed it met all the guidelines and regulation set forth by FEMA, and that it had been reviewed also by FEMA. Would you explain FEMA's involvement in the contract process?
Sure.
And how you monitor federal dollars before they're allocated?
Sure. So let me be clear. The Whitefish contract was not a FEMA contract. PREPA entered into this contract in late September. We were notified several weeks after the fact. Our lawyers, there's not a lawyer inside FEMA that would have ever agreed to the language that was in that contract to begin with, so let me be very clear about that. And we raised the red flag and basically saying, you know, we're not sure this is a sole source contract or a competitive rate. There were many things wrong. There was also language in there that would suggest that the federal government would never audit Whitefish, which there's not a lawyer inside FEMA that would ever agree to that type of language. So the bottom line is that as I understand, not $1 has gone towards that contract from FEMA. And what we're doing is rectifying to make sure that PREPA has not requested any funding for that reimbursement effort. We have a lot of work to do when it comes to grant monitoring at all levels of government. It's not just FEMA, but it's at the state and the local governments when it comes to the grantees that are there. We ask them to always follow pre-disaster bid laws and policies, because when you change those policies after a disaster, it's going to hang you up in an audit. We also ask them to follow emergency bid laws when it comes to the procurement process according to 2 CFR. Okay? And so we have a lot of work to do when it comes to training and ensuring the grant monitoring, but in that case, that was not our contract.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll be interested as you dig into that one for what the learnings are from that situation. Sure. And how we can improve that process. It's always one of the concerns. When we have a disaster, of course, we want to move quickly. People are in need. People are dying. But we also want to make sure we're accountable,
sure,
efficient, and there's oftentimes opportunity for a tremendous amount of waste in some kind of in a situation we're throwing billions of dollars at some of these disasters. So I'll look forward to that. Follow what you learned from that, Mr. Long, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Long, one of my constituents volunteered through the AFL-CIO to provide assistance in Puerto Rico. He was there from October 4th through the 18th. And he certainly said the citizens remarked how grateful they were for the assistance that was being provided by his group, because no one else seemed to be there to help, was at least his experience on the ground. I know a group of National Nurses United had a similar experience and also made some of the same comments to me. So it seems to be a common perception that assistance wasn't reaching the people in need in Puerto Rico, that there were some distribution problems, that stuff may have gone to distribution centers, but it wasn't getting actually out to the individuals. So my question is, why were we hearing that from volunteers, and do you believe that was an issue?
I can't speak to the gentleman's or to the constituents' direct experience, but I can explain the logistical complexities that we faced when it came to the humanitarian issues of getting meals and water out. As we were discussing earlier, all the ports were damaged. It took us time to not only rebuild the air traffic control system, but open up the ports. We pre-staged quite a bit of food in our Caribbean area division before the storm. You can only stage so much on the island. We also checked with Governor Rosselló and the school systems. They had a lot of food inside the shelters, multiple days of food in each one of the school shelters that were there. So we tried to put as much food forward as possible before the storm hit. When it came to the diminished capacity, obviously the state and local governments, they were disaster survivors. As we began to push in the food to the island, we had to quickly mobilize 10 regional distribution hubs where we would fly it in, set up and stage all the commodities, and then force the food and water to each one of these distribution hubs. We had to establish communication with all 78 mayors because there was no survivable comms that were there. We started communicating and sending liaisons to mayors and making sure that we got the commodities to them directly. If they couldn't get it to the final mile, then we would actually airdrop if there were isolation issues. And I don't know how many isolation-based airdrops we've made, but they're continuing today. Did we get to everybody? It's hard to say. Part of it was the lack of communications and the ability that we recognized that people weren't sure where to go. And in some cases, what I saw with my own eyes, I went to Utuado in the central portions, mountainous regions of Puerto Rico, where some of the folks in the isolated communities are being really resilient, and they're not choosing to come to the areas where food and water is. And so the bottom line is, I know that this is one of the, I feel certain that this is probably one of the largest humanitarian missions that we've ever conducted in the United States, and there are tens of millions of meals and water that were pushed, and there is a lot of assets on there. I've also asked the Office of Inspector General to look into how our commodities were being used by some of the mayors as well, and it's my understanding that the FBI may be looking at that as well.
Well, I appreciate your candor, and I know this was an incredibly difficult task that you were involved in and continued to be involved in probably for quite some time, and I appreciate your efforts on that. And you've been very candid in this hearing today, and that's refreshing to have that kind of candor, because the idea is that we have to learn, celebrate what we did right and learn from our mistakes to be ready for the future. But what would be your assessment in Puerto Rico on a scale of 1 to 10 in your expert capacity as to FEMA's ability to meet the disaster?
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do. One of the first things I want to do is come back and have an after action. I want to figure out the grant funding that went to FEMA, went to Puerto Rico. What did we get in return of that? I want to make sure that, are the commodity capabilities that are on the island are obviously too small. How do we set up island territories to be more self-sufficient, that it doesn't require a massive DoD mission to be able to fly these things in? There are a whole host of improvements that need to be made, and I recognize that, and I'll be dedicated to making sure that we find out and doing an exhaustive after action. And if there are issues where I need the Senate's support, I'll be definitely coming back to you to ask for that support to change the way that we do business in the future. Trust me, I do not want to go through this event again.
Right.
As much as anybody else.
Well, and I asked the 1 to 10, that may be tough for you to do, but perhaps for the average Puerto Rican, how would they rate the federal government's response? You've been on the ground an awful lot. I appreciate that. From
Senator,
1 to 10, what do you think they would say?
With all due respect, obviously people have different experiences. I'm not interested in giving myself a grade or rating each other. Quite honestly, that'd be the only thing that the media picked up today about this congressional hearing, if that's the case. Could we have done better? Did we move as fast as people want? Obviously, in some cases, no. But if you look at in the Miami Herald this morning, the State Department representative, Luis Rivera, read his assessment and go talk to the mayors. Go talk to the 78 mayors and all of them and get your assessment from them, please, because for me to sit back and say we did things perfectly, I know we didn't. Of course, there's things that, I wish had gone better or things that I had known going into that event, obviously. But the bottom line is that I know at the end of the day, we pushed as hard as we could. Our partners pushed as hard as we could, and we moved as fast as the situation allowed. And this is one of the most logistically complex disasters that this nation has faced.
Well, yeah, you mentioned talking to local mayors. Actually leads into the second question I have, is that, as you know, Isabella County and Midland County, Michigan, experienced some catastrophic flooding this summer, one of the long list of issues that you had that were on your plate this year. And I heard from county administrators, emergency responders, as well as impacted constituents in general, that they were very appreciative of the work that FEMA did to help them in responding to that flooding. But that said, they also thought that FEMA could have done a much better job of coordinating with local officials at the beginning of the response efforts. And in our experiences, I think, as you mentioned, upfront coordination with local authorities can go a long way to facilitating that kind of response. But that's what I heard from my folks in Michigan, although, again, being supportive of your efforts, but thinking that was a lack in FEMA's efforts was the local coordination with local officials. What do you think we should be doing to better that type of cooperative effort?
Personally, I would like to expand our footprint. I would like to change our footprint and graduate beyond the regional offices. I would like to develop, what we call state integration teams that are multifaceted, that are there working with the state every day and being able to drive out to your local counties and doing things such as approving mitigation plans with having had it to come all the way back through the region or up to headquarters. I'd like to change the workforce. I would like to make our reservist cadre more in line with what the National Guard approach is, so that you can have a full-time job, step away from your job to go support FEMA in a disaster without losing that daytime job. I would like to change our entire workforce program to be more like an FBI model. We're the only public safety agency in the country that doesn't have a true academy-style model of hiring and graduating people through our system, so that we're training everybody to be the next federal coordinating officer that understands all aspects of this program. I'm frustrated by our hiring processes. I would like to rewrite the book on how we do that and how we maintain and utilize disaster reservists who are critically important to our mission.
Well, I think those are all really good thoughts, so I look forward to working with you on those issues going forward. Thank you, Mr. Long.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Peters. One of the concerns I have, just kind of listening to some of the dialogue here, is I don't want to see FEMA be the primary responder here. I believe the role is to support state and local governments, to support them. And the more we expect out of FEMA, first of all, we're going to spread them thinner. And now you're going to have, again, a one-size-fits-all model, and it's going to be the federal government that's going to have to decide where all these assets have to be deployed ahead of time. States and local governments need to understand that. They need to understand their risks. They need to be held responsible as well. And so I think we need to be very careful as we go down this road and say, well, hey, how come FEMA didn't do the job perfectly? And listen to people's complaints, they didn't coordinate quite as well as we would like to. Again, it's to help them. FEMA's role is to help, to be subordinate to that. So I think it's incredibly important. I've only got one other point I want to make, because it was pretty interesting in talking to you, Administrator Long. We have so much foodstuffs and water, to a certain extent, down in Puerto Rico. You point out the fact the private sector is now asking you, we need to reestablish ourselves. If our population is going to rely on FEMA and the federal government to provide meals, we're not going to have the private sector firing back up and have grocery stores operating properly. Can you just kind of talk about what?
Sure, you're absolutely right. So the goal is always to get the retail industry back up and running, and the last number I saw was roughly 90%. Obviously, as the retail industry comes up, we should be drawing down on the commodity mission. In many cases, the mayors have asked us to stop the flow of food, but continue the water issues until the water system is fully back online. And so it's a constant communication battle every day, or not battle, it's just constant good communication every day with the mayors to understand what the need is, where the private sector market is. But as we go forward, I do think that we have to form tighter bonds with the private sector and understand the modeling to see this not only in Puerto Rico, but in California or Florida or Texas, to say, here's where the market is, here's where the gas stations are coming back online, so that we can tailor the response day in and day out.
I think your name describes what your function is, Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's not federal recovery. It's not long-term recovery. There's going to be other federal agencies, but hopefully more state and local governments that are going to really take up the responsibility of recovering in their local jurisdictions. With that, Senator Carper.
Just to follow on what the chairman's saying, the last 100 years, 33 Category 5 hurricanes. This fall, 2, within a matter of weeks of one another. And we've seen this very interesting chart that the chairman has, very instructive chart that the chairman has shown that indicates what's happening in terms of frequencies of this kind of crazy weather that we're faced with. And I would just this is a shared responsibility, but I would feel that we had failed in our responsibilities collectively if we simply rebuild help rebuild an electric grid in Puerto Rico that is just as vulnerable, that is just as energy inefficient, and that is just as polluting as what they largely have faced in past decades. I think we'd really have missed an opportunity. Our colleague, Senator Peters, asked you, Mr. Long, to evaluate or maybe provide a grade of some sort to the work of FEMA so far. We have a saying in Delaware: when a little fighter, we're a little state, but when a little fighter is fighting a big fighter and wins, we say that the little fighter fights above his or her weight. And I think FEMA is punching above its weight, and we applaud that. I think the grade to be assigned is probably incomplete, because there's plenty of work still to do, and I think you know that. Richard Nixon used to, I'm the only Democrat I know that quotes Richard Nixon, but Nixon used to say, the only people who don't make mistakes are people who don't do anything. Think about that. Tom Carper always says, everything I do, I know I can do better. And if it isn't perfect, make it better. So that's our goal. We're not, perfection is probably not achievable, but we certainly want to head in that direction, regardless of whether we sit on this side of the dais or your side. Senator Peters also talked about the sort of the interaction interface between state and local folks and FEMA. And I would this would be one short question for you, Administrator Long. But there's been some feedback that there's been a disconnect between the government of Puerto Rico, FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, various contractors on the ground regarding roles and responsibilities, who is doing what activity. I don't think that's to be totally surprising. But what are you doing to ensure that a cohesive effort that supports the governor of Puerto Rico, who is ultimately in charge of recovery efforts? Could you just respond to that?
Mm-hmm. Sure, it's a great question. Clear communication is the line, is what's needed to succeed. And I speak to Governor Rosselló on multiple times a week on a regular basis. But what we do, obviously, to have wide area management capability over the magnitude of everything that's happened, is I have to rely very heavily on federal coordinating officers. And for the example of Puerto Rico, Mike Byrne is my federal coordinating officer. Technically, he's appointed by the president, if you look at the Stafford Act. And so I have federal coordinating officers over each one of these disasters that I stay in touch with. But I also reach out very regularly to Governor Rosselló. And I got to tell you, every day that man goes to work trying to do the best that he can for Puerto Rico. And I have deep respect for the governor and what he's trying to do and work through. And he's facing the most complex disaster of many of them. And so the communication's good, but I have to set up Recovery Command on site and allow the decisions to be made on site rather than all the way back up here in D.C. Incident command decisions have to be made closest to where the disaster is, not up here.
Yeah, sometimes when I see adult children of my friends who've gone on to do great things with their life, I say they picked the right parents. And I would say to Ricky Rosea, the governor now, that he picked the right parents. And my old colleague, Pedro Rosea, with whom I served from 93 to 2001 as governor. I want to ask one question for each of you, and then I'm done. But the question is this. Just name one thing. Each of just name one thing that folks on my side of the aisle, those with whom we serve here in the Senate and the House, one thing that we need to be doing to enable you and your folks to do a better job. Just one thing, please. And we'll just start, if I can, with Mr. Cadler. Are you an Air Force Academy graduate?
Yes, sir, I am.
Navy Sleuths Air Force. Good for you.
Sir, you beat us in football, though.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir. I think one of the issues that came up was about streamlining processes and effects and activities. For the health care, we talk about minutes and hours, really depending life and death decision and being able to intervene positively. And I think one of the areas that Congress should look at is dependencies. Dependencies affect all the activities here. What makes it more streamlined, what makes it more efficient, what makes it more, most importantly, effective. And those are the areas that I would identify as most important.
Good, thanks. General Jackson, thank you.
Senator, thanks for the question. Since we've spoken mostly about the power grid restoration, I think that's where my comment would come from. And that is, I think if Congress can decide what end state looks like, there's multiple requirements that could be out there, multiple things that could be done. They all cost different amounts of money. But what does end state look like, and what does the nation want us to do? Whether it's what the Corps is doing or what whoever will do in terms of what the power generation will look like, what the transmission lines and such will look like. Being able to craft what end state looks like with the resources to match would be my recommendation.
Good. Thanks so much.
Senator, thanks for the question. I'd say continue to support the men and women in uniform. Specifically, the Department of Defense did enormous work in all of these hurricanes. As you know, the number of Navy ships, the strategic airlift that was involved in this, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps active reserve and Corps, that made a huge difference in each one of these hurricanes. The Defense Department has involved greatly in that responsibility of supporting civil authorities, and that needs to continue because it makes all the difference to our citizens.
When I'm talking with folks from different armed services other than the Navy, sometimes there's a friendly inter-service rivalry, as you know, not just on the football field, but I always say to them at the end of those conversations, different uniforms, same team, and it's a great team. Administrator Long.
Externally for the entire country, I think survivable communications is something that we have to address with the private sector. We become more and more vulnerable every day as we go to digital networks. And when you don't have redundant systems or mitigated systems designed to handle all hazards, then it creates panic. And as we've seen, we basically just went through a complete and total communication blackout for an island, and it creates a lot of panic, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misinformation. And that was incredibly frustrating. So I think we have a lot of work to do for survivable comms. Internally, fix the NFIP, do more pre-disaster mitigation, and let's come back to the drawing board on the disaster, on the DRF, the Disaster Relief Fund.
Thanks to all of you and the teams you lead. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my final comment, I appreciate my colleagues like this chart. There's a number of factors that are built into the dramatic increase in the FEMA declarations. One of them is just so we declare more disasters as a FEMA disaster. And my concern is that, I won't say the word abdication, but certainly local and state authorities are happy to have the federal government spend their money and be responsible for a greater share of these things that are occurring within their states. So I mean, that's part of the factor here. But again, I want to thank all of you. I think your efforts have been extraordinary. I would give you a pretty high grade, personally. Again, this is unprecedented what has happened here. You get 51 inches in any place. There's no way to plan for that. That's going to create a lot of destruction. You get Category 5 hurricanes going over an entire island, even one that's in the Caribbean that is used to hurricanes. That's going to cause disaster. You just don't snap your fingers and alleviate all pain and suffering. So again, I think the men and women that have worked with you have done an extraordinary job, and I thank all of them, and I thank all of you. And with that, this hearing record will remain open for 15 days until November 15th, 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.
Sir, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead. My pleasure, sir.
Chairman, thank you very much. Great job.
Really great. Daniel and Emma are 17. I'm going to drive it. Do you think that it is not helpful for you? They're doing great. Tom, I still remember the wonderful lunch you did. I'll definitely do that. I'm so proud of it. Fair enough. Thank you. Good to see you. Good to see all of us. I know this man very well. John. Good to see you, sir. How are you? All right.
Good. Actually,
I'm Peter and John.
I had a really quick question. This is for a different committee that you're on, the EPW. To see any when those EPA nominations are being for the air, water, chemicals, obviously. I think they just came out of committee.
Yeah, they just came out of committee last week. I've not heard any discussion of when they're coming to the floor. I think we're lined up right now to work on a number of other nominations off the executive calendar. I think they're mostly judicial noms, so I think that's the immediate priority for the majority and maybe for the administration. So one of the things that would enable us to move forward on EPA nominations that are not controversial would be for the folks at the EPA, including their administrator, to finish the job they've begun in terms of responding to, I think, a very legitimate questions on a wide range of issues that they have jurisdiction over, shared jurisdiction over. If they were to do that part of the job, the non-controversial nominations, which are pretty good ones too, would move along much more quickly.
Right now, when you say they're focused on the judicial nominations first to go to the floor, can you give an estimate as to if you're talking about the EPA nominations being pushed back to next month or to the beginning of next year? Like, what can you estimate?
Rather than tell you something I'm not sure of, let me just leave it.
No, go ahead. Please, feel free to tell me.
Senator?
Thanks, Senator.
Hey, Eric Katz with Government Executive.
What do you want, Eric? Normally I only take one question after I'm just kidding.
Well, I was wondering what you thought Yes.
The Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Suspended, I should say. And I ask unanimous consent that I be able to speak until such time as my remarks are concluded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the House and the Senate are moving forward on a final draft of our tax reform bill, and I'm excited about the progress that we're making. We've got one goal in mind with tax reform, Mr. President, providing real relief to ordinary Americans, to the parents who are questioning whether they can afford the car that they need to fit their growing family, to the single mom wondering how she is going to pay the bills this month, to the middle-aged couple worrying about a secure retirement. Everything in our tax reform framework is centered on providing relief to these Americans. To start with, we're going to provide them with a substantial amount of direct relief by lowering their tax rates and doubling the standard deduction so that they're keeping more of their paycheck every month. We're also going to significantly expand the child tax credit. And we're going to simplify and streamline the tax code so that it's easier for Americans to figure out what benefits they qualify for, and so they don't have to spend a lot of time and money filing their taxes. All of these reforms mean more money in Americans' pockets. But, Mr. President, we're not stopping there. We're also going to focus on reforming the business side of the tax code so that we can give Americans access to the kind of jobs, wages, and opportunities that will set them up for a secure future. In order for individual Americans to thrive economically, we need American businesses to thrive. Thriving businesses create jobs. They provide opportunities. They increase wages and invest in their workers. And they invest in new equipment, facilities, and product lines to innovate and expand their businesses. Right now, though, Mr. President, our tax code is not helping businesses thrive. Instead, it's strangling both large and small businesses with high tax rates. Our nation has the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world, at least 10 percentage points higher than the majority of our international competitors. And that's a problem for American workers because high tax rates leave businesses with less money to invest in their workers, to increase wages, or to create new jobs. And this situation is compounded when you're an American business with international competitors that are paying a lot less in taxes than you are. It's no surprise that U.S. businesses struggling to stay competitive in the global economy don't have a lot of resources to devote to creating new jobs and increasing wages. A study from the White House Council of Economic Advisors estimates that reducing the corporate tax rate from 35% down to 20% would increase average household income by $4,000 annually. A second study shows a similar pay increase. Boston University professor and public finance expert Larry Kotlikoff found that lowering the corporate tax rate to 20% would increase household income by $3,500 per year on average. That's a significant pay raise for hardworking Americans. In addition to lowering the corporate tax rate, there's another important thing that we can do to increase the availability of jobs here at home. And that's reforming our outdated worldwide tax system. Under our worldwide tax system, American companies pay U.S. taxes on the profit they make here at home, as well as on part of the profit that they make abroad once they bring that money home to the United States. The problem with this is that most other major world economies have shifted from a worldwide tax system to what's called a territorial tax system. In a territorial tax system, you pay taxes on the money that you earn where you make it and only there. You aren't taxed again when you bring money back to your home country. Now, most of American companies' foreign competitors have been operating under a territorial tax system for years. So they're paying a lot less in taxes on the money that they make abroad than American companies are. And that leaves American companies at a disadvantage. These foreign companies can underbid American companies for new business simply because they don't have to add as much in taxes into the price of their products or services. And when foreign companies beat out American companies for new business, it's not just American companies who suffer, Mr. President. It's American workers. It's the American workers employed by these companies who live and work in literally every state in the Union. And it's the American workers who work for the small and medium-sized companies that form the supply chain here in the United States. For every American company that operates in countries around the world, there are countless companies here at home that supply the raw material for the products that are sold abroad. Businesses that handle the packaging and shipping of those products, and enterprises that supply support services like accounting, legal, and payroll services. America's global companies rely on a web of supporting businesses that spans the country. And when these global companies struggle, so do these supporting businesses and their workers. By transitioning from a worldwide tax system to a territorial tax system, we will not just be boosting wages, jobs, and opportunities for American workers employed by these global companies. We will also be increasing wages, jobs, and opportunities for workers at the countless small and medium-sized businesses throughout our country who make up the supply chain for America's global companies. Finally, Mr. President, our tax plan will tackle the other key part of improving the playing field for American workers, and that is lowering the tax rates on small businesses. Small businesses are incredibly important for new job creation. But like big companies, right now small businesses are being strangled by high tax rates. That can make it difficult for small businesses to even survive, much less thrive and expand their operations. Lowering small business tax rates and making it easier for small businesses to recover their invested capital more quickly will free up the money that small business owners need to expand their businesses, to add workers, or give employees a raise. Together, these aspects of tax reform are essential to reversing the lackluster economy of the last 8 years. Americans deserve better, and tax reform can be the key to putting this country back on the path to solid, sustainable economic growth. Mr. President, before I close today, I'd like to just switch gears for a minute and talk about judicial nominations. We've had the chance to confirm some excellent nominees so far this year, many of whom Democrats have ultimately supported. But despite this fact, Democrats have insisted on delaying the process of almost every single nomination to a district or circuit court. Well, that's pretty much the definition of partisanship. When you obstruct nominees based not on any disagreement you have with them, but simply because you don't like the person who's doing the nominating. Now, Mr. President, Democrats' delays are ultimately pretty pointless. We're not going to stop confirming nominees just because Democrats are dragging out the process. But these delays are a disservice to the American people. There are a lot of important issues the Senate needs to be debating, from spending bills to tax reform, and the time that we waste on pointless partisan exercises is time taken from those important issues. Mr. President, while Democrats' partisanship is frustrating, there's much more serious issue that has come up during these judicial confirmations, and that's the anti-religious sentiment displayed by some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle during the hearing on judicial nominee Amy Barrett's nomination, which we'll be voting on this week. Ms. Barrett's qualifications are well known. The American Bar Association, which rates judicial nominees, has given her its highest rating of well qualified. As my colleague, the minority leader, has said, the Bar Association's evaluation is, and I quote, the gold standard by which judicial candidates are judged, end quote. But Mr. President, despite her judicial qualifications, it became clear in the hearing on her nomination that some of my colleagues think she should be disqualified because she is a practicing Catholic. That's right, Mr. President. Apparently, practicing your religion is now grounds for declaring you unfit to be a judge. Here's what the Constitution has to say about that. This is from Article 6, and I quote, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." Let me repeat that, Mr. President. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. In other words, Mr. President, in the United States, you can't be disqualified from serving as a judge because you're a believing Catholic or a believing member of any faith. The only qualification the Constitution imposes is a commitment to uphold the Constitution. Yet the second-ranking Democrat in the United States Senate apparently thought it was appropriate to ask Ms. Barrett if she was a practicing member of her religion, with the implication that if she was, it might jeopardize her fitness for being a judge. Mr. President, Democrats' questioning is not going to stop Ms. Barrett's nomination, but it is simply disturbing nonetheless. It is a scary thing when leaders of a major political party imply that there is no role for religious people in public life. And I don't need to tell anybody that that's contrary to everything that our founders stood for. The right to be able to practice religion freely, yes, in public too, was so fundamental to the founders' understanding of liberty that they made it the very first freedom mentioned in the Bill of Rights. People of faith have made incalculable contributions to our country, and faith has driven some of the greatest movements in American history, from the abolitionist movement to the civil rights movement. I hope the Democrat Party doesn't move further down the path of excluding religious people from public life. Mr. President, if they ever succeed in excluding people of faith from government, they will have destroyed one of the freedoms on which our country rests. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for an appropriate amount of time to finish my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. President, one of the great things that, one of the privileges really about being in the Senate is actually being to preside, as you're doing right now, to sit in the chair, presiding officer of the Senate, and listen and watch my colleagues talk about issues that matter to them. A lot of times, issues that matter to their states. And, you know, we have this amazing country of ours, so many great states. I get to hear great stories, great traditions when I'm presiding. Some relate to Texas, where the presiding officer's from. And, you know, celebrating our unique traditions while still appreciating that at our best, we share values as Americans together. Opportunity, liberty, justice, fairness really is one of the things that makes the Senate a great body and what makes us strong as a nation. And so, Mr. President, one of the things I like to do is come down to the Senate floor and pass on and talk about some of the traditions in my state. Some of the things that I think makes Alaska the greatest state in the nation. I know some of my colleagues won't fully agree with that, but we all get to brag about our state. And when I do that, I like to talk about this individual who we recognize as the Alaskan of the Week. Often somebody who's doing something in a remote part of Alaska that not a lot of people know about that's very, very important. And to share that with my colleagues in the Senate and other Americans watching on TV. And I would like to today, Mr. President, recognize a young Alaskan from Gamble, Alaska, named Chris Apasuguk, a young whaler who's helping to keep the traditions that we have in Alaska, Alaska Native whaling, alive and well, and he is our Alaskan of the Week. So this year, Chris was a keynote speaker at the Elders and Youth Conference, which is a precursor to the Alaska Federation of Natives Conference held each year in one of our cities. It's the largest annual gathering in the United States of any Native peoples, and there's nothing like it in all the country. AFN, as we call it in Alaska, is certainly a highlight of my year. My wife and I and our kids always try to get there. So let me spend a few minutes talking about why Chris's speech about whaling was so important and what happened after he landed a huge bowhead whale in Alaska, and why that was so inspiring for so many in my great state, but really around the country. Gamble, Alaska is where Chris calls home. It is a Yupik village about 700 people on St. Lawrence Island on the northwest edge of Alaska. It's one of 11 Alaska communities that participate in 2 whaling seasons recognized and authorized by the International Whaling Commission. And these are subsistence communities. So what does that mean? Subsistence communities, meaning whale meat is actually a necessity in feeding these communities. I should point out that we have no road systems at all in northern Alaska. Most of Alaska has no roads that connect it to community, and certainly not in Gamble. And Mr. President, you and I have had the opportunity to travel around Alaska. You've seen our great state, and you know that many communities are only accessible by air or seasonal barge. Some can only be reached by certain times of the year because of the weather, and these communities need food, and they need whales. The annual bowhead whale migration provides the largest subsistence resource available in these remote areas of our great state. Even so, when a whale is taken, the sharing does not stop with the residents of the community. Each whale produces between 6 and 25 tons of food on average. This meat is shared with other subsistence communities in our state and with family members and elders throughout the state. A hugely important part of Alaska Native culture. And this is another example of the resourcefulness of Alaska Native peoples that have enabled them to survive in the Arctic, some of the toughest weather and conditions anywhere in the world, for millennia, and that have shaped the culture of Alaska and the character of our state today. So back to Chris. He's an extraordinary hunter, even by standards of Gamble, a community of extraordinary hunters. He could aim and shoot a rifle at the age of 5. By 11, he'd trained himself to strike whales. As one writer put it, quote, standing steady in front of the skiff with a gun, riding the Bering Sea swells like a snowboarder. This past April, Chris and his father set out on a boat in the Bering Sea to do what their ancestors have been doing for thousands of years. After they got a bearded seal, they spotted a spouting bowhead. Chris took the first shot, and it was accurate. And it was a huge whale, 57 feet, 11 inches. It took 2 hours to tow it to shore and 4 days for the community to carve it up. As always, when a whale is landed, it's time for celebration in the community, and this time was no different. But, Mr. President, shortly after this, things unfortunately went sour for Chris and the community. A radical special interest activist with a large online following read the story about Chris and the whale, and he began to attack Chris, and so did many of his followers from all across the globe, hundreds of people, most of them adults, cyberbullying and attacking a 16-year-old boy from Gamble, Alaska, who had at that point only left his village once in his life. Shameful. No respect, no civility, and I mean vicious attacks, Mr. President. I won't repeat them here. It's enough to say that they were greatly upset in the community. Chris, his family, his mother cried all night. Chris was angry that he and his family were being attacked for partaking in this necessary tradition that his community and his ancestors have been doing for thousands of years. Thousands of years. However, this young man, despite the hateful messages from adults who live a world away, despite the names they were calling him, Chris, now 17, cut through the noise, stood strong, gave a great speech at AFN, and he will continue to hunt and feed his family and his community the way his ancestors have done for millennia. At his speech last week at AFN, he said, "Will you stand with me as I continue my hunting traditions of my family?" And the crowd applauded, all of whom rose when he said this. Will you stand with me as we continue our subsistence activities that we have undertaken for thousands of years? Mr. President, I hope that everyone across the country stands with this extraordinary young man Truly brave, courageous.
Carlos, restricted.
A little left, all right.